The humiliation did not arrive with raised voices or shattered glass, but with the soft, lethal courtesy of a London morning. It moved through drawing rooms like a draught beneath a closed door, felt before it was named. She sensed it in the way a teacup was steadied too carefully, in the pause that followed her name, in the sudden industry of fans and glances when she entered. In the early years of the new decade, when the Regency lent its glitter to every cruelty, a young gentlewoman could lose everything without a single word being spoken aloud. She had been taught from girlhood how to stand. Her mother had instructed her in posture and patience, in the measured art of appearing untroubled. Born to a family of respectable blood and modest means, she possessed no fortune to shield her, only breeding, discipline, and the expectation of a prudent marriage. That expectation had seemed fulfilled. Her engagement, carefully arranged and publicly approved, promised security and a quiet place within society. She had accepted it not with girlish rapture, but with the steady relief of one who understood the world as it was. The truth reached her by accident, as such truths often do. A letter, folded too hastily, slipped from a book meant for her own hands. A familiar name appeared where it ought not to have been, traced in ink she recognized. There was no need to read further than the first line. In that moment, the air thinned, and the room, though unchanged, became uninhabitable. Her fiancé's betrayal was precise, deliberate, and entwined with a deeper wound, for the recipient of his affections was the companion she trusted above all others. Together they had walked arm in arm through the season, shared confidences whispered behind fans, and laughed at dangers they believed themselves too clever to meet. She did not cry out. She folded the letter again, smoother this time, and returned it to its place. Dignity, she had been taught, was not loud. When she confronted him, it was with calm questions and a voice kept steady through will alone. His answers were evasive, his regret expressed more for inconvenience than for harm. Of her friend there was only silence, a silence that accused more cruelly than denial. By evening, she understood that the injury was complete. London required no explanation. The engagement dissolved with careful phrases and practiced regret, and society supplied the rest. Whispers attached themselves to her name, light as powder, impossible to brush away. Though she was the wronged party, suspicion followed her steps, as it so often did with women who stood alone. Invitations ceased. Doors that had opened readily now hesitated. Her former friend vanished into the protection of relations, while her former fiancé retained his place, his error softened by indulgent smiles. She withdrew from the season not as a gesture, but as necessity. To remain would be to invite conjecture, and conjecture could ruin what little remained to her. Days passed in a quiet townhouse where the curtains were drawn earlier than fashion required. She wrote letters she did not send, and answered those she received with a restraint that bordered on apology. Each morning brought the same reckoning. Her future, once clearly marked, had narrowed to a single uncertain path. Yet even in retreat, obligation found her. A final invitation arrived, formally worded and impossible to refuse without comment. An assembly at Almacks, issued before her disgrace had fully ripened, now stood as her last appearance among the arbiters of London respectability. She prepared for it with methodical care, choosing composure over ornament, resolve over hope. If she must be seen, she would be seen correctly. Almacks that evening shimmered with its customary authority. Chandeliers cast their judgment in light, and patronesses surveyed the room with eyes trained to measure worth. She entered on the arm of an elderly relation, aware of the brief stillness that marked her progress. It was there, amid that charged quiet, that she first noticed the Duke. He stood apart from the press, tall and grave, his presence commanding without display. Widowed, powerful, and spoken of more often in connection with Parliament than pleasure, he observed the room as one accustomed to weighing consequence. Their eyes met only once, and then briefly. There was no smile, no signal of interest. Yet when her name was spoken nearby with that softened pity she had come to dread, his attention sharpened. Later, when she found herself momentarily without escort, it was his voice, measured and unmistakably public, that offered assistance. The gesture was simple, correct, and devastating in its effect. Heads turned. Whispers stalled. She accepted, because refusal would have been remarked upon, and because something in his manner suggested intention rather than impulse. As he guided her through the room, the humiliation that had shadowed her seemed, for the first time, to pause. She did not mistake courtesy for rescue, nor power for kindness. Still, as the music swelled and society recalculated its judgments, she sensed that the story being told about her had shifted, if only slightly. The night did not end in triumph, but it ended in possibility, and for a woman recently undone by betrayal, that was enough to keep her standing. As she departed, the cool air beyond the doors steadied her breath, and the carriage lantern cast a narrow circle of light upon the street. London resumed its murmur, unchanged, yet she felt altered within it, no longer merely the subject of rumor. Somewhere behind those walls, a man of consequence had chosen to be seen choosing her, and such choices carried weight. She did not allow herself gratitude or dreams, she allowed only resolve. Whatever had begun that night was not hers to name, but it had interrupted the erosion of her dignity. The carriage rolled on, bearing her toward a future still uncertain, yet contested, and the city watched, wondering what might next be claimed or lost. The days following that evening did not soften society's gaze, they sharpened it. London spoke more quietly now, but with greater precision, as though each whisper were a needle placed with care. Her name reappeared in conversation, no longer as an object of pity alone, but of curiosity. Why had the Duke noticed her? Why had he intervened? Such questions traveled swiftly, carried by servants, by carriage wheels, by glances exchanged over porcelain cups. She remained within doors, observing the city from behind lace curtains, aware that stillness itself could become a statement. When next she ventured out, it was to a morning call long overdue. She dressed with deliberate simplicity, understanding that excess would invite speculation and humility could be mistaken for defeat. As she descended the steps of the townhouse, a familiar unease settled upon her shoulders, the sense of being examined before she was even seen. The street, however, offered an unexpected tableau. A carriage bearing the Duke's crest stood at the curb, its presence unmistakable. The footman delivered a parcel with precise courtesy, asking only that it be accepted as a matter of respect. Inside, she found a slim volume of poetry, unadorned save for a discreet inscription. There was no flourish, no language of seduction, merely acknowledgment. In a society that traded in implication, the restraint of the gesture spoke loudly. She understood at once the risk he had taken. Such a gift, publicly delivered, aligned his name with hers beyond a single evening. She did not yet know his intentions, but she recognized resolve when she encountered it. Her former friend reappeared days later, not in person, but as rumor. It was said she had been invited to a musicale, and that her attendance was assured. The timing was precise enough to feel deliberate. The past, it seemed, was unwilling to loosen its hold. When the evening arrived, the room brimmed with anticipation that disguised itself as civility. She entered aware that she was no longer invisible. Eyes followed her, measuring not her gown, but her composure. The Duke was present, positioned as before with quiet authority. When their greeting was exchanged, it was correct, restrained, and impossible to misinterpret. He did not linger, yet neither did he withdraw. Throughout the evening, he placed himself where he might be seen, offering her attention without presumption. Each small act accumulated meaning. A chair drawn back. A glass offered. Silence maintained where commentary might have flourished. In this manner, he constructed a shield not of affection, but of presence. The scandal sharpened when her former fiancé arrived. His appearance, unanticipated yet inevitable, altered the room's balance. He approached her with rehearsed concern, his voice pitched for witnesses rather than honesty. Before she could reply, the Duke intervened, his tone polite and final. The exchange was brief, unremarkable in words, devastating in implication. Boundaries were redrawn in public, and the past was quietly denied permission to speak. Later, as the music softened and the gathering thinned, the Duke requested a moment of her time. The phrasing was impeccable, the request made in full view of chaperones. They spoke near an open window, the night air carrying the scent of damp stone and distant rain. He acknowledged, without naming it, the discomfort his actions might cause. He offered no apology. Instead, he spoke of principle, of the necessity of clarity in a world governed by suggestion. She listened, recognizing that he addressed not merely her circumstances, but her character. She replied with equal care. Gratitude was expressed without surrender, acceptance without assumption. She made no claim upon him, nor did she seek reassurance. In doing so, she surprised him. The pause that followed was charged with thought rather than feeling, and when he spoke again, it was to ask permission for continued association. The words were measured, yet the risk beneath them was unmistakable. By the time they parted, nothing had been promised. Yet as she returned home, the city felt altered once more. The rumors that would follow her tomorrow would not be of disgrace, but of alignment. In a world where reputation was currency, the Duke had invested in her openly, and she had consented to be seen receiving it. The night ended not in resolution, but in escalation, and she understood that retreat was no longer possible without loss. Sleep did not come easily. Her thoughts returned to the careful architecture of the evening, to the way each movement had been weighed before execution. She recognized strategy where others might have imagined sentiment, yet strategy itself could be intimate when deployed with such precision. The Duke had not offered rescue, he had offered alliance, and alliances altered destinies as surely as declarations of love. In accepting his attentions, she had stepped onto a visible stage, one where hesitation would be read as weakness and silence as consent. By morning, London had begun to respond. A card arrived bearing a name once withheld, followed by another, and then another still. The invitations were cautious, yet their existence marked a shift. She answered them selectively, aware that discernment was now her armor. Each acceptance would be interpreted as confidence, each refusal as calculation. The balance was delicate, and she moved within it with renewed awareness of her own worth. Yet beneath this progress lay unease. She knew how swiftly favor could sour, how admiration might curdle into accusation. The Duke's presence offered protection, but it also invited scrutiny, and scrutiny demanded justification. Standing at her window, watching the city resume its restless rhythm, she acknowledged the truth she had avoided. Whatever bond was forming would soon require definition, and definition would exact a price. The next encounter would decide whether this fragile ascent became security or spectacle, and she sensed that choice would not rest solely in her hands alone. She encountered him again not amid chandeliers or measured applause, but in the quieter corridors of obligation, where society's armor thinned and voices lost their audience. A charity visit had been arranged with impeccable propriety, and she attended because refusal would have been read as ingratitude. He arrived later than expected, his presence announced not by ceremony but by the instinctive stillness that followed him. When their eyes met, recognition passed between them, steady and unadorned, as though they had already agreed to speak plainly when the moment allowed. The room offered no privacy, yet it offered restraint. They spoke first of the cause, of ledgers and needs, of the virtues expected of those with means. He listened as carefully as he spoke, and when others drifted away, he asked whether he might escort her to the carriage. The request was framed as duty, but the intention beneath it was unmistakable. She accepted, aware that this interval would be noticed, and that noticing now carried consequence rather than threat. Outside, the day had turned uncertain, clouds lowering as if to compress the city into confession. The carriage door closed, sealing them into a space governed by proximity and motion. For a moment neither spoke. The rhythm of the wheels set a pace that invited truth without haste. He began by acknowledging the rumors, not to repeat them, but to disarm them. He spoke of how swiftly stories hardened into verdicts, and how often silence was mistaken for guilt. His tone was measured, yet beneath it lay impatience with injustice. She answered with care, offering neither defense nor complaint. She spoke of discovery without spectacle, of the moment when certainty dissolved and dignity became a deliberate act. She admitted the fear that followed, the knowledge that her worth would be debated by those who had never known her. As she spoke, Her voice did not waver, but her hands tightened in her lap, betraying the effort such composure required. He noticed, and the noticing mattered. When he replied, it was to confess his own reticence. Widowed young enough to be expected to remarry, and old enough to be cautious, he had learned the costs of sentiment. Duty had become his refuge, principle his language. Yet he admitted that watching her endure scrutiny without surrender had unsettled him. It suggested a strength he respected and a loneliness he recognized. The carriage slowed, then resumed, carrying them deeper into conversation neither had anticipated. He asked permission before speaking further, a courtesy that startled her more than boldness would have done. With consent granted, he spoke of intention. He would not offer protection that diminished her agency, nor alliance that demanded gratitude. If they were to be seen together, it would be as equals consenting to association, aware of risk and willing to bear it. The clarity of his terms steadied her. For the first time since her betrayal, choice returned to her hands. She considered the future he implied, one shaped by public alignment and private restraint. She asked what he sought beyond reputation and convenience. His answer was neither romantic nor evasive. He sought a partner whose judgment he trusted, whose presence did not require performance. He sought peace earned through respect. The simplicity of the desire, spoken without flourish, reached her more deeply than promise could have done. Rain began to fall, tapping the carriage roof with quiet insistence. The sound drew them into a shared pause. She realized then that she had not been courted, but consulted, and that such consultation was itself intimate. She told him that she could not offer affection shaped by haste or fear. If there were to be feeling, it would arrive slowly, if at all. He accepted this without disappointment, as though patience were already part of his design. When the carriage halted, neither moved at once. He thanked her for her candor, and she thanked him for his restraint. The exchange, though brief, carried the weight of a vow unspoken. As he assisted her down, his hand remained precisely where propriety allowed, yet the space he left for her decision was unmistakable. Watching him depart, she understood that their bond now rested not on rumor, but on shared knowledge. That evening, alone, she replayed their words, measuring not what had been said, but what had been respected. The city beyond her window murmured as ever, indifferent to individual reckonings. Yet within her, something had settled. The Duke had not claimed her story. He had listened to it, and in listening, altered its course. She slept with the knowledge that the next step would require courage of a different kind, and that courage, once invited, seldom allowed refusal. Morning arrived with a steadiness that felt earned rather than assumed. She rose early, not from anxiety, but from resolve, and reviewed the letters awaiting reply. Each response would signal intention, and intention now mattered. She chose her words with the same precision she had learned to apply to her bearing, allowing neither hope nor fear to dominate the line. The memory of the carriage lingered, not as a thrill, but as a benchmark against which future conduct would be measured. Across the city, he too prepared, considering not sentiment but sequence. He understood that clarity demanded action, and that delay would be interpreted as uncertainty. His position afforded influence, but influence required responsibility. To act publicly would bind them both, to hesitate would expose her anew. He resolved to move with deliberation, neither rushing nor retreating, guided by the terms they had named together. By midday, the rain had cleared, leaving the streets washed and reflective. London resumed its choreography, unaware of the private accords shaping its next spectacle. She stepped into that brightness with composed intent, knowing the interval of quiet had ended. What followed would unfold under observation, and observation would require courage sustained. The path ahead was not yet declared, but it was chosen, and the choosing itself felt like a beginning. The evening chosen for the declaration arrived with deliberate grandeur, as though London itself had been instructed to bear witness. The assembly rooms glowed with candlelight reflected endlessly in glass and gilt, every surface polished to amplify scrutiny. She entered with practiced composure, aware that her presence no longer provoked uncertainty but expectation. The air seemed charged with anticipation, not of scandal, but of resolution, and she felt the collective attention settle upon her like a held breath. He was already there, unmistakable in bearing, positioned where approach required intent. The Duke wore authority as others wore ornament, with ease shaped by habit rather than vanity. When he turned and saw her, the acknowledgment in his eyes was neither possessive nor hesitant. It was a recognition between equals who had agreed, silently, that the hour for ambiguity had passed. Around them, conversations softened, drawn instinctively toward whatever outcome might follow. The former fiancé stood at the periphery, diminished by contrast rather than reproach. His presence no longer unsettled her, for time and clarity had stripped him of power. She observed him briefly, noting how small regret appeared when it had been indulged too long. The past, once heavy, now felt instructive rather than oppressive, a lesson learned at cost but retained with purpose. Music was announced, and couples assembled, yet before the first measure could settle, the Duke stepped forward. He requested her attention with formal precision, his voice carrying without strain. Silence followed, swift and complete. He did not rush the moment, allowing the room to recognize the significance of what was about to occur. When he spoke, it was not to flatter, but to state intention, and intention, in such a setting, possessed undeniable force. He addressed her history without exposing it, speaking instead of resilience observed and character proven. He spoke of admiration grounded in conduct rather than circumstance, and of partnership sought not for convenience but for respect. His words were carefully chosen, each one placed to affirm her standing before all who listened. Then, with measured grace, he asked for her hand, not as spectacle, but as pledge, offering his name as shield and his regard as promise. The room remained still, the weight of the moment pressing upon her. She felt neither triumph nor fear, only clarity. When she answered, her voice carried the steadiness she had cultivated through trial. She accepted with dignity, acknowledging the trust extended to her and the future implied by his request. There was no flourish, no dramatics, yet the simplicity of her response sealed the moment more firmly than passion might have done. Reaction followed swiftly. Approval replaced curiosity, and whispers transformed into affirmation. Patronesses inclined their heads, alliances recalibrated, and the story London would tell itself shifted irrevocably. The Duke offered his arm, and she took it, conscious that the gesture now symbolized choice rather than rescue. Together they moved through the room, no longer observed as anomaly, but as certainty. Later, removed from the immediate gaze, they spoke briefly, privately, though still within the boundaries of propriety. He thanked her for her courage, acknowledging the cost of public acceptance. She thanked him for the respect he had shown her autonomy, recognizing the restraint that had guided his actions. Between them, understanding settled, calm and deliberate, promising a union shaped by mutual regard rather than illusion. In the days that followed, London adjusted with remarkable speed. Invitations arrived without hesitation, and her name was spoken with renewed assurance. Preparations commenced not in haste, but with thoughtful order. The Duke consulted her on matters often reserved for assumption, valuing her judgment as he had promised. She found herself engaged not merely to a man, but to a role that allowed her voice, a prospect both daunting and affirming. Marriage did not transform them overnight. Affection grew as trust had, gradually and without spectacle. He revealed kindness in consistency, she offered warmth through understanding. Their household became known not for extravagance, but for harmony, a quiet counterpoint to the excesses of their peers. Observers remarked upon the balance between them, noting how respect lent depth to every shared glance. Years later, when memory softened the edges of pain, she would recall the betrayal that had once threatened to define her and recognize it as the necessary fracture through which her strength had been revealed. Society, she learned, could wound, but it could also witness redemption when courage met opportunity. The Duke's proposal had restored her place, yet it was her endurance that had earned it. As they departed London for their estates, carriage wheels echoing against dawn-washed streets, she watched the city recede without regret. The whispers that had once pursued her no longer held meaning. Ahead lay a life chosen with intention, shaped by dignity preserved and love allowed to grow unhurried. The future, once uncertain, now unfolded with measured promise, and she met it not as a woman saved, but as one who had claimed her own becoming.